Szanowni Państwo, witam w Pałacu.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Palace of the Commonwealth, the seat of the National Library, a unique place. The name is indicative of the story of this building as a public building, but also that it is a treasure trove of the Republic. It contains the most valuable manuscripts, traces of thoughts, desires, records of history. Among the most valuable collections is the Zbigniew Herbert archive, and here none of us doubt that it is on the short list of the greatest poets of Poland and the world. It is a great fortune that this building contains the Zbigniew Herbert archive, the Czesław Miłosz archive, the Leszek Kołakowski archive, and the papers and archives of many writers of various centuries. During our meetings, we are invoking the greatest traditions, what we want to remember, what we want to talk about. In the Zbigniew Herbert year, 20 years after his death, we are all, as lovers of poetry, happy to say that this is a poet who didn't have to wait to be rediscovered. This was largely thanks to his poetry, but also thanks to all those who popularize his work and who made sure that memory is not forgotten. Among them is first and foremost Katarzyna Herbert, whom I would like to welcome here tonight. The host of today's event is, as always, the president of the Zbigniew Herbert Foundation, Maria Dzieduszycka, to whom I will now give the floor. Good evening and welcome everybody on behalf of the Zbigniew Herbert Foundation. And I want to invite our guests to join us on stage, Alissa Valles, Ryszard Krynicki, and John Maxwell Coetzee. Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our guests. Alissa Valles is an American poet born in Amsterdam. After graduating from the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies in London, she worked at the BBC and at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. She received fellowships from the Poetry Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. She is currently a member of the editorial board of the Akron series in contemporary poetics. The first book of poems by Alissa Valles, Orphan Fire, was published in 2008 in the United States. In 2014 in London, she published a book-length poem, and her next book of poems, Hospitality, is forthcoming and will be published in the spring of next year. Alissa Valles is also a translator of Polish literature, above all Polish poetry, into English. She is the editor and co-translator of the collected poems and prose of Zbigniew Herbert. Last year, Alissa, a book of poems by Ryszard Krynicki, Nasze życie rośnie, was published in the US, translated by Alissa Valles. She also translates Miron Białoszewski, Zuzanna Ginczanka, and Aleksander Watt. Alissa, I would now like to express my gratitude and admiration for your work as a translator, and thank you for being so generous with your talent and time allowing the English-speaking readers to read to Polish poetry. Alissa, thank you very much for that. Ryszard Krynicki has been our guest at these events for a number of years. These events are held here at the Palace on Herbert's birthday, but taking advantage of the opportunity, I want to recall that as a poet, as the author of over a dozen books of poetry, he is the first and so far only Pole to have received, in the year 2015, the International Zbigniew Herbert Poetry Award. One cannot fail to mention here, where the Zbigniew Herbert archive is stored, that Ryszard Krynicki is the editor, together with his wife Krystyna, publisher of the collected poems of Zbigniew Herbert. Thanks to his patient, diligent work, thanks to hundreds of hours spent in this building, reading, deciphering Herbert's manuscripts, the Krynicki Publishing House, A5, has also published an extensive volume, a two-volume edition, in fact, of Herbert's scattered works, including many previously unpublished poems. We are very grateful to you for that, Ryszard.
John Maxwell
Coetzee was born in 1940 in South Africa, where he grew up and finished school. He studied in South Africa and the United States. He's written 17 novels, as well as critical and literary essays, memoirs, and translations. Among the numerous awards he has received for his literary work, there is, above all, the Booker Prize, awarded twice, and the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2003. John Maxwell Coetzee currently lives in Australia, and he is an honorary fellow of the University at Adelaide. We are grateful to him for many years for his essays and his interest in the work of Zbigniew Herbert, and for accepting our invitation, for being here with us tonight. Thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, the program is as follows. In a while, we will hear several selected poems by Zbigniew Herbert, which will be read by Ryszard Krynicki. Then we'll ask Alissa Valles to say a few words. We'll have a few more poems read by Ryszard, and in closing we will hear a lecture speech by John Maxwell Coetzee on Zbigniew Herbert and his work. So, Ryszard, over to you. And the poems will be projected on the screen in English.
Ofiarowanie Ifigenii. Agamemnon jest najbliżej stosu. Płaszcz zarzucił na głowę, ale oczu nie zamknął. Sądzi, że przez tkaninę dostrzeże błysk, który stopi jego córkę jak szpilkę do włosów. Hipiarz stoi w pierwszym szeregu żołnierzy. Widzi tylko małe usta Ifigenii, które łamią się od płaczu, jak wtedy, gdy zrobił jej straszną awanturę o to, że wpina kwiaty we włosy i daje się na ulicy zaczepiać nieznajomym mężczyznom. Raz po raz widok hipiasza wydłuża się niepomiernie i małe usta Ifigenii zajmują ogromną przestrzeń od nieba do ziemi. Kolchas o oczach dotkniętych bielmem widzi wszystko w mętnym owadzim świetle. Jedyna rzecz, która go naprawdę porusza, to obwisłe żagle okrętów stojących w zatoce, które sprawiają, że smutek starości wydaje mu się w tej chwili nie do zniesienia. Podnosi przeto rękę, aby rozpoczęto ofiarę. Chór umieszczony na zboczu obejmuje świat we właściwych proporcjach. Niewielki, błyszczący krzak stosu, białych kapłanów, purpurowych królów, głośną miedź i miniaturowe pożary żołnierskich hełmów, a wszystko to na tle jaskrawego piasku i niezmiernego koloru morza. Widok jest pyszny, jeśli przywołać na pomoc odpowiednią perspektywę. Apollo i Marsjasz. Właściwy pojedynek Apollona z Marsjaszem, słuch absolutny kontra ogromna skala, odbywa się pod wieczór, gdy, jak już wiemy, sędziowie przyznali zwycięstwo Bogu. Mocno przywiązany do drzewa, dokładnie odarty ze skóry Marsjasz krzyczy. Zanim krzyk dojdzie do jego wysokich uszu, wypoczywa w cieniu tego krzyku. Wstrząsany dreszczem obrzydzenia, Apollo czyści swój instrument. Tylko z pozoru głos Marsjasza jest monotonny i składa się z jednej samogłoski A. W istocie opowiada Marsjasz nieprzebrane bogactwo swego ciała. Łyse góry wątroby, pokarmów białe wąwozy, szumiące lasy płuc, słodkie pagórki mięśni, stawy, żółć, krew i dreszcze, zimowy wiatr kości nad solą pamięci. Wstrząsany dreszczem obrzydzenia, Apollo czyści swój instrument. Teraz do chóru przyłącza się stos pacierzowy Marsjasza. W zasadzie to samo A, tylko głębsze, z dodatkiem rdzy. To już jest ponad wytrzymałość Boga o nerwach z tworzyw sztucznych. Żwirową aleją, wysadzaną bukszpanem, odchodzi zwycięzca, zastanawiając się, czy z wycia Marsjasza nie powstanie z czasem nowa gałąź sztuki, powiedzmy konkretnej. Nagle pod nogi upada mu skamieniały słowik. Odwraca głowę i widzi, że drzewo, do którego przywiązany był Marsjasz, jest siwe zupełnie. Z nienapisanej teorii snów pamięci Jeana Amery. Oprawcy śpią spokojnie, sny mają różowe, poczciwi ludobójcy, którym już wybaczyła krótka ludzka pamięć, obcy i plemieńcy. Łagodny wiatr obraca kartki rodzinnych albumów, okna domu otwarte na sierpień, cień jabłoni w kwiatach, pod którą się zgromadził zacny ród. Bryczka dziadka, wyprawa do kościoła, pierwsza komunia, pierwszy uścisk matki, ognisko na polanie i niebo gwieździste, bez znaków i tajemnic, bez apokalipsy. Więc śpią spokojnie, sny mają pożywne, pełne jadła, napojów, tłustych ciał kobiecych, z którymi gry miłosne w gąszczach zagajników. A nad tym wszystkim płynie głos niezapomniany, głos czysty jak źródło, niewinny jak echo o chłopcu, który spotkał różę na łące pośród wrzosów. Dzwon pamięci nie budzi widm ani koszmarów, dzwon pamięci powtarza wielkie odpuszczenie. Budzą się wcześnie rano, pełni woli mocy, starannie golą kupieckie policzki, resztę włosów układają jak wieniec laurowy. pod wodą zapomnienia, która zmywa wszystko, namydlają swe ciało mydłem marki Macbeth. Dlaczego sen, schronienie wszystkich ludzi, odmawia swojej łaski ofiarom przemocy? Dlaczego w nocy krwawią wśród czystej pościeli i wchodzą w swoje łóżka jak do sali tortur, jak do celi śmierci, jak w cień szubienicy? Przecież i oni mieli matkę i widzieli las, polanę, niebo, jabłoń w kwiatach, róże. Kto wygnał to wszystko z zakamarków duszy? Oni także przeżyli chwilę szczęścia. Więc dlaczego ich wycie budzi w nocy niewinnych domowników i zrywają się raz jeszcze do szalonej ucieczki, tłukąc głową o ścianę, a potem już nie śpią, wpatrzeni tępo w zegar, który niczego nie zmieni. Dzwon pamięci powtarza wielkie przerażenie, dzwon pamięci bije niezmiennie na trwogę. Zaiste ciężko wyznać, oprawcy odnieśli zwycięstwo, ofiary na całą wieczność życia są już pokonane. Więc muszą sami ułożyć się z tą karą bez winy, z blizną wstydu, odciskiem palców na policzku, podłą wolą przeżycia, pokusą wybaczenia, a opowieść o piekle budzi już słuszny niesmak. Nie ma już teraz miejsca, gdzieby zanieść skargę, niepojęte wyroki feruje Trybunał Snów.
I want to thank the Herbert Foundation, and particularly Katarzyna Herbert and Marysia Dzieduszycka for the invitation to take part in this celebration, and the National Library for its hospitality tonight, and for all it has done to preserve Zbigniew Herbert's legacy and keep his papers safe in this treasure house of Polish culture. Herbert's archivist Henryk Citko deserves special thanks, as does Krystyna Krynicka for her role as publisher of extraordinarily beautiful Herbert editions. Ryszard Krynicki, whose tireless work as editor and now also decipherer of archive texts continually enlarges for us this extraordinary body of work. I also owe a huge debt of thanks to Barbara Toruńczyk and Marek Zagańczyk for their exquisite editions of Herbert's correspondence and essays. It isn't easy to stand before an audience like this, which includes some of the people from whom I've learned most about Polish literature, and to claim to bring some news about Herbert that you don't already have. The best I can do, it seems to me, is to say a few things about how I came to Herbert and what I feel I owe him. Although talking about oneself is rather un-Herbertian, expressing gratitude and devotion to a master is not. It seems appropriate on Herbert's birthday to invoke his words in a poem directed to his own master, the philosopher Henrik Elzenberg. Praise be to your books, slender, spacious, more lasting than bronze. Praise be to your cradle. I had bookish parents, and I was lucky enough to find Polish books by Bruno Schulz and Alexander Watt, Miłosz and Herbert, Borowski and Białoszewski in our home library early on in life. When I was 16, I heard Herbert read at a poetry festival in Holland. That year, 1988, was also my political awakening. Reading books and newspapers, and then making a bus journey via the crumbling Berlin Wall to Warsaw and Leningrad, as it was still called in 1989, gave me a glimpse of a cultural world which seemed to me richer than anything I could find elsewhere. Mine is a generation which was subject to the full force of postmodernist theory at university, but also as a generalized vapor in the culture. However, the fact that I was a student in London at a school of Slavonic and East European studies meant that initiation into the popular methods of reading was accompanied by a narrative about the history of Europe, and Eastern Europe in particular, which had a sobering effect. In the case of Herbert, this Eastern European route paradoxically led to places that were part of my heritage to begin with, to Athens and Jerusalem, places to which my path was obstructed, I felt, by the convoluted syntax of Parisian philosophers and by the aggressive secularism and materialism of my society. Herbert's will to find his way to the sources of beauty, knowledge, and freedom, and hover there with all his faculties sharp in uncertainty and doubt. This was to me a form of heroism worthy of emulation, and certainly worth years of grappling with a thorny language. Herbert wasn't the first poet I tried to translate from Polish. That was Ryszard Krynicki, circa 2001. I began to work on Herbert 15 years ago, when I was for a brief time a student in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. The first piece of writing by Herbert I translated was not a poem, but a letter to Henryk Elzenberg, written in a year of high Stalinism, when Herbert, going on 27, was transferring to Warsaw from Torun, where Elzenberg taught him the Stoics. October 22, 1951. Dear Professor, on my way to Warsaw, I stopped for a few hours in Torun in the hope that I would be able to see you and thank you for your intellectual patronage, with capital letters, up to this point. I also came to ask you not to strike me from the student register, as it's very important to me to stay in touch with you. In Warsaw, I will be at the mercy of Marxified philosophy and trashy pseudo-cosmopolitanism in which an innocent provincial can easily lose his way. I would very much like to take my oral exam with you and work under your supervision. Respectfully, Zbigniew Herbert. P.S. My apologies for the form and content of this letter written on the stairs. P.P.S. Professor Czyżowski, whom I saw, asked me whether writing poetry doesn't get in the way of philosophy. I told him I was ashamed and that I would do my best to kick the habit. I translated a group of these letters at the request of Adam Zagajewski, who was putting together an anthology of Polish writing to be published in the United States. The job he gave me, and funded from mysterious sources, was one of many examples of generosity with which Adam supported my poetic beginnings, and I saw it as a continuation of a conversation about poetry and ideas we carried on while I was his student. In fact, the job of translating that exchange between an old philosopher and a young poet had a more unpredictable effect. Translating Herbert was like being hooked up to an oxygen tank. Maybe the tank also had something more potent in it. Translation is a strangely intimate way of entering a text. It can be, and some say should be, like a love affair. When I started translating Herbert, I was at the same time attending a seminar on Plato's Phaedrus, conducted by Professors John Coetzee and Jonathan Lear, and thus was given permission on the most august philosophical authority, Plato's, I mean, to fall in love with Herbert for my own soul's benefit. This passion was endorsed on a weekly basis at the cost of exposure to Plato's dangerous doctrines. In another letter to Elzenberg from Warsaw, Herbert described his own struggle to fathom an ancient text. Bound to the philological chariot, I batter my weary head, stripped of poetry, naked and disgraced. This is how I felt trying to parse even a few lines of Plato, who finds ingenious ways of condescending to poets even while stealing their tricks. Translating Herbert was pure joy, like being taken by the hand out of the city along a riverbank lined with prophetic trees. November 2nd, 1951. Dear Professor, I put to myself, in answer to your letter, the question what I really look for in philosophy. The question is rather Faustian, and perhaps it would be more appropriate to ask what philosophy demands of me, what responsibilities the discipline lays upon me. The answer to the first, more my own version of the question, turns out to be extremely compromising. I look for emotion, powerful intellectual emotion, painful tensions between reality and abstraction, yet another rending, yet another deeper than personal cause for sorrow. And in that subjective cloud, respectable truth and sublime measure are lost. So I'll never be a decent university philosopher. I prefer living and suffering philosophy to brooding on it like a hen. I would rather it be a fruitless struggle, a personal cause, something going against the order of life, than a profession. At the Committee on Social Thought, which I had imagined under the influence of Saul Bellow would be a comic romp in an Arcadia of intoxicating ideas, I learned fairly quickly three things. One, that I too would never make a decent university philosopher. Two, that translation, if practiced diligently and passionately, can be its own form of philosophical investigation. And that three, rather than beating down the practice of poetry, translating can clarify and refine that practice. After the letters, I had a go at a Herbert poem, and soon the situation got completely out of hand. Professor Coetzee kindly agreed to sit down with me every other week or so in the autumn of 2003 to talk about Herbert poems, the English translations of Miłosz Scott and the Carpenters, as well as my own efforts. I remember the occasion when I delivered a draft of the first Herbert poem I translated, The Sacrifice of Iphigenia. When we met, John held up the sheet of paper between two fingertips like a dirty sock and said, "I think you can do better than this." I'm sure there were a number of problems with my version of this relatively straightforward prose poem, but the one I remember is my rendering of the beautifully concise sentence, "Podnosi przeto rękę, aby rozpoczęto ofiarę." I had said, "He therefore raises his hand to begin the sacrifice," which in English is vague, meaning either that Kalchas himself is raising a torch to the pyre, or that he's giving a sign for the sacrifice to begin. In Herbert's poem, there's no place for this ambiguity. Despite its formal simplicity, it hinges on differences of perspective and scale and their implications for moral judgment and response. That distinction is as significant as the one between Apollo flaying Marsyas with his own hands and Apollo giving the order for Marsyas to be flayed, as pictured, respectively, in Titian's great painting and in Claude Lorrain's landscape with the flaying of Marsyas. Claude shows the god poised on a rock some distance from his victim, pointing toward him in a gesture I now unavoidably associate with a U.S. soldier photographed smugly pointing at a naked Iraqi prisoner. The precision of Herbert's language had a special force in 2003, the first year of a war born of lies and accompanied, at least in the US, by obfuscating political rhetoric, manipulated journalism, and in the spring of 2004, a public debate about torture that destroyed my taste for university philosophy for good. At the same time, American poetry seemed to me inadequate. It broke down between self-righteous protestations, what Herbert might call, in his poem to Ryszard Krynicki, all too self-evident protestations, and shallow aesthetic games, or what Herbert might call the piano at the top of the Alps. Herbert's Iphigenia offers instead a sober analysis of the geometry of compassion, and in recalling the launch of the Trojan War with the sacrifice of a young girl, hints that the essence of war lies in the blind destruction of innocence and perhaps of femininity. In its reflection on pain, distance, and beauty, this prose poem is a precursor of Apollo and Marsyas, one of a handful of poems with Auden's The Shield of Achilles and Mandelstam's lines on the unknown soldier that managed to bring a measure of justice to the 20th century. Iphigenia is also a subtle reflection on how sacrifice, which aims to unite a community, on another level depends on the preservation of a rigid hierarchy. Between the sacrifice and Iphigenia and the Herbert poem I translated most recently lies a third of my life, and in all the work I've done, I felt his presence near. At some times, I feel he has literally kept me sane. It's a remarkable thing about his poetry that instead of bearing down on one with the weight of personality, it trains one to do without, to locate the poetic impulse not in an assertion of self acting on the world, but in the power of the objective world to suggest new ways of seeing and being. It seems to me that at this moment in history, this lesson, what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls Herbert's austere discipline of the imagination, is useful not just for poetry, but for the survival of the planet. It's a discipline that can serve to control fantasies of political revenge and unfettered power, stubbornly returning the imagination to the peculiar dignity of the pebble or the oak, to the fragility and singularity of life on earth. The Herbert poem I translated last, from an unwritten theory of dreams, is by a grim coincidence also a poem that speaks of the failure of justice and consolation, of torture as it affects those on each side of the weapon. Like Jean-Emery's Gestapo officers enjoying Schubert in their retirement, the torturers of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, who are sadly also the torturers of Stara Kikute, have been free to go on enjoying sweet dreams and, in some cases, promotion to high-profile jobs in government. Memory's bell awakens no ghosts or nightmares. Yet Herbert's poems of pain call one strongly to life, speaking in a voice full of warmth and insuppressible humor, to which scholars are often less receptive than the so-called ordinary readers I meet when I am out and about. Over the years, I've read Herbert's poems closely with students at colleges and schools in the US and the UK, with kids in juvenile detention in San Francisco, with junior diplomats in Geneva, with a group of contentious Jewish seniors in Brooklyn, with aspiring poets in Boston, and with groups in refugee camps in Greece and Macedonia. Even when Herbert perplexes, he leaves no one cold. He takes possession. One of the discoveries I've made reading and translating is that the more one tries to possess him, to get to the core of his poems, the more one strips away their onion layers of meaning and counter-meaning, the more elusive Herbert himself becomes. And in a final Herbertian irony, the more one finds oneself laid bare, stripped of certainty, naked and open, as a poet should be. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. doliny. Po deszczu gwiazd na łące popiołów zebrali się wszyscy pod strażą aniołów. Z ocalałego wzgórza można objąć okiem całe beczące stado dwunogów. Naprawdę jest ich niewielu, doliczając nawet tych, którzy przyjdą z kronik, bajek i żywotów świętych. Ale dość tych rozważań. Przenieśmy się wzrokiem do gardła doliny, z którego dobywa się krzyk. Po świście eksplozji, po świście ciszy, ten głos bije jak źródło żywej wody. Jest to, jak nam wyjaśniają, krzyk matek, od których odłączają dzieci, gdyż jak się okazuje, będziemy zbawieni pojedynczo. Aniołowie stróże są bezwzględni i trzeba przyznać, mają ciężką robotę. Ona prosi: schowaj mnie w oku, w dłoni, w ramionach. Zawsze byliśmy razem. Nie możesz mnie teraz opuścić, kiedy umarłam i potrzebuję czułości. Starszy anioł z uśmiechem tłumaczy nieporozumienie. Staruszka niesie zwłoki kanarka. Wszystkie zwierzęta umarły trochę wcześniej. Był taki miły, mówi z płaczem. Wszystko rozumiał, kiedy powiedziałam. Głos jej ginie wśród ogólnego wrzasku. Nawet drwal, którego trudno posądzić o takie rzeczy, stare, zgarbione chłopisko, przyciska siekierę do piersi. Całe życie była moja, teraz też będzie moja. Żywiła mnie tam, wyżywi tu. Nikt nie ma prawa, powiada. Nie oddam. Ci, którzy, jak się zdaje, bez bólu poddali się rozkazom, idą spuściwszy głowę na znak pojednania, ale w zaciśniętych pięściach chowają strzępy listów, wstążki, włosy ucięte i fotografie, które, jak sądzą naiwnie, nie zostaną im odebrane. Tak to oni wyglądają na moment przed ostatecznym podziałem na zgrzytających zębami i śpiewających psalmy. Siódmy anioł. Siódmy anioł jest zupełnie inny. Nazywa się nawet inaczej. Szemkel. To nie to, co Gabriel złocisty, podpora tronu i baldachim, ani to, co Rafael, stroiciel chórów, ani także Azrael, kierowca planet, geometra nieskończoności, doskonały znawca fizyki teoretycznej. Szemkel jest czarny i nerwowy i był wielokrotnie karany za przemyt grzeszników. Między otchłanią a niebem jego tupot nieustanny. Nic nie ceni swojej godności i utrzymują go w zastępie tylko ze względu na liczbę 7. Ale nie jest taki jak inni. Nie to, co hetman zastępów Michał, cały w łuskach i pióropuszach. Ani to, co Azrafael, dekorator świata, opiekun bujnej wegetacji ze skrzydłami jak 2 dęby szumiące. Ani nawet to, co Dedrael, apologeta i kabalista. Szemkel, Szemkel, sarkają aniołowie. Dlaczego nie jesteś doskonały? Malarze bizantyńscy, kiedy malują 7, odtwarzają Szemkela podobnego do tamtych. Sądzą bowiem, że popadliby w herezję, gdyby wymalowali go takim, jak jest. Czarny, nerwowy, w starej, wyleniałej aureoli. Przeczucia eschatologiczne pana Cogito. Tyle cudów w życiu pana Cogito, kaprysów fortuny, olśnień i upadków, więc chyba wieczność będzie miał gorzką. Bez podróży, przyjaciół, książek. Za to pod dostatkiem czasu, jak chory na płuca, jak cesarz na wygnaniu. Pewnie będzie zamiatał wielki plac czyśćca lub nudził się przed lustrem opuszczonej golarni, bez pióra, inkaustu, pergaminu, bez wspomnień dzieciństwa, historii powszechnej, atlasu ptaków. Podobnie jak inni, będzie uczęszczał na kursy tępienia ziemskich nawyków. Komisja werbunkowa pracuje bardzo dokładnie. Trzebi ostatki zmysłów kandydatów do raju. Pan Cogito będzie się bronił, stawi zaciekły opór. Najłatwiej odda swój węch. Używał go z umiarem, nigdy nikogo nie tropił. Także odda bez żalu smak jadła i smak głodu. Na stole komisji werbunkowej złoży płatki uszu. W doczesnym życiu był melomanem ciszy. Będzie tylko tłumaczył surowym aniołom, że wzrok i dotyk nie chcą go opuścić. Że czuje jeszcze w ciele wszystkie ziemskie ciernie, drzazgi, pieszczoty, płomień, bicze morza. Że wciąż jeszcze widzi sosnę na stoku góry, 7 lichtarzy juczni, kamień sinymi żyłami. Poda się wszystkim torturom łagodnej perswazji, ale do końca będzie bronił wspaniałego odczuwania bólu i paru wyblakłych obrazów na dnie spalonego oka. Kto wie, może uda się przekonać aniołów, że jest niezdolny do służby niebieskiej i pozwolą mu wrócić przez zarosłą ścieżkę na brzeg Białego Morza do groty początku. Dziękuję. Dziękuję bardzo.
And now the envoy of Mr. Cogito, read by Zbigniew Herbert at a reading in Poznań at the Collegium Novum of the Adam Mickiewicz University, December 11th, 1984.
Przesłania pana
To
Cogito.
zdjęcie zostało.
Idź dokąd poszli tamci, do ciemnego kresu, po złoto runo nicości, twoją ostatnią nagrodę. Idź wyprostowany wśród tych, co na kolanach, wśród odwróconych plecami i obalonych w proch. Ocalałeś nie po to, aby żyć. Masz mało czasu, trzeba dać świadectwo. Bądź odważny. Gdy rozum zawodzi, bądź odważny. W ostatecznym rachunku jedynie to się liczy. A gniew twój bezsilny niech będzie jak morze, ilekroć usłyszysz głos poniżonych i bitych. Niech nie opuszcza ciebie twoja siostra pogarda dla szpiclów, katów, tchórzy. Oni wygrają. Pójdą na twój pogrzeb i z ulgą rzucą grudę, a kornik napisze twój uładzony życiorys. I nie wybaczaj, zaiste nie w twojej mocy wybaczać w imieniu tych, których zdradzono o świcie. Strzeż jednak dumy niepotrzebnej, oglądaj w lustrze swą błazeńską twarz, powtarzaj, zostałem powołany, czy nie było lepszy. Strzeż się osłości serca, kochaj źródło zaranne, ptaka o nieznanym imieniu, dom zimowy, światło na murze, splendor nieba. One nie potrzebują twego ciepłego oddechu, są po to, aby mówić, nikt cię nie pocieszy. Czuwaj, kiedy światło na górach daje znak, wstań i idź, dopóki krew obraca w piersi twoją ciemną gwiazdę. Powtarzaj stare zaklęcia ludzkości, bajki i legendy, bo tak zdobędziesz dobro, którego nie zdobędziesz. Powtarzaj wielkie słowa, powtarzaj je z uporem, jak ci, co szli przez pustynię i ginęli w piasku. a nagrodzą cię za to tym, co mają pod ręką, chłostą śmiechu, zabójstwem na śmietniku. Idź, bo tak tylko będziesz przyjęty do grona zimnych czaszek, do grona twoich przodków Gilgamesza, Hektora, Rolanda, obrońców królestwa bez kresu i miasta popiołów. Bądź wierny, idź.
Let me begin by thanking the Herbert Foundation for inviting me to Warsaw to deliver this memorial address. It is an honor to have an opportunity to express in public my admiration for a poet whom I followed decade after decade as he thumped on his board that said, yes, yes, or no, no. My admiration may be uninformed. I speak no Polish. I have very little knowledge of the Polish literary tradition, but it is, I believe, deeply felt. I first encountered Herbert in 1968 in a little paperback that appeared in the Penguin Modern Poets series, a selection of poems translated by Czesław Miłosz and Peter Dale Scott. Later, there arrived the translations by John and Bogdana Carpenter, which I read as soon as they came out. In 1991, I published an essay on Herbert in a United States journal. The essay was specifically about how Herbert responded, or seemed to me to respond, to writing under a regime of censorship. As I reread that essay now, it is obvious that I was handicapped by my lack of specific and first-hand knowledge of how censorship operated in Poland under communism. I wrote a second and better essay on Herbert a few years ago. This evening's talk will, to a large extent, be based on that essay. In the years that intervened between these two efforts to put on paper the meaning of Herbert's poetry to me, I visited Poland several times and also made the acquaintance of Alissa Valles, in whom I found a respect for Herbert's poetry that matched my own, but also a deeper understanding of Herbert's relation with Polish literature, Polish history, and Polish society, from which I learned a great deal. Zbigniew Herbert died 20 years ago, a fact that is hard to believe, having lived most of his life under regimes that were inimical to what we can loosely call freedom of expression. His writing bears evidence of his historical situation as a man trying to live out a poetic and intellectual vocation in a hostile environment. The traces can sometimes be overt, for example, in his satiric counterattacks on the regime, but are more usually concealed by ironic masks or Aesopian language. Herbert was not a poet martyr as, say, Osip Mandelstam was. Nevertheless, the record shows a lifetime of principled opposition, first to the Nazis, then to the communists. Until well into his 30s, he led a fringe existence with none of the rewards that someone of his education and talents might have expected. After the thaw of 1956, his growing reputation opened up opportunities for travel outside Poland and eventually led to fellowships and visiting professorships in the West. But unlike Czesław Miłosz, he chose against exile. The unspectacular, unheroic species of integrity and stubbornness that characterizes Herbert's life weaves its thread through his poetry too. For the sake of brevity, which is one of the Herbertian virtues, I will call this theme the faithful life, picking up the word faithful from the last line of the Envoy of Pan Cogito, a poem to which I will return. The line in English reads simply, "Be faithful, go." The faithful life is not the same as the life of faith. The difference between the two, namely that you do not need to have faith to be faithful, might be called central to Herbert's ethic, were it not for the fact that privileging the faithful life over the life of faith and erecting it into a credo, an article of faith, would at once qualify it for skeptical interrogation of the Herbertian variety. In Herbert's oeuvre, there is a steady stream of poems that turn on an opposition between purity of theory, purity of doctrine, which he aligns with the divine or angelic, and the impure, the messy, the human. The best known of these poems is Apollo and Marsyas. Apollo, who is a god and therefore inhuman and therefore without human feelings, flays alive the satyr Marsyas, reacting to Marsyas's prolonged howl of agony with nothing but a fastidious shudder. Apollo may have won the musical contest. Marsyas is undergoing the fate of the loser. But the howl that comes from Marsyas's throat, rudimentary though it may be as music, expresses every atom of his exposed, that is, skinned, human, that is, ungodlike being, with a petrifying intensity that the god cannot equal. This is only one of a number of poems by Herbert that put the case for the human in its unequal contest with the divine. The world that God has created, the world that carries the imprint of divine reason, may be perfect in theory, but it is hard to bear in reality. Even the next world turns out to be pretty unendurable by human standards. As new arrivals discover at the heavenly gates, not the tiniest memento of their old life will be allowed to accompany them. Even babes are to be removed from their mother's arms. I quote, "Since, as it turns out, we shall be saved, each one alone." Unquote. God's heaven turns out to have an uncanny resemblance to Auschwitz. And I'm referring here to the poem At the Gate of the Valley. What is wrong with systems, to Herbert, is that they are systems. What is wrong with laws is that they are laws. Beware of angels and other executives of perfection. The only angel even tentatively to be counted on the side of humanity is the seventh one, Shemkel, who is retained in the angelic squad only out of respect for the sacred number 7. Black, nervous, in his old threadbare nimbus, Schenkel has been fined many times for illegal importation of sinners. Marxism, one need barely point out, is deeply colored by Christian eschatology. The world of achieved communism, in which each will receive according to his need, and in which the state or earthly power will have withered away, is literally heaven on earth. Herbert's satirical reports on heaven are inevitably also reports on life in the worker's state. In heaven, because the materials to hand are human and therefore imperfect, certain compromises have to be made. Foregone are the luminous circles, the choirs of angels, etc. What we end up with is an afterlife not too different from life in People's Poland. The most interesting of the poems that deal with the afterlife is in the 1983 collection, Report from a Besieged City, arguably the strongest of the 9 collections Herbert published during his lifetime. In a poem called Pan Cogito's Eschatological Premonitions, his persona, Pan Cogito, reflects on life after death and on what kind of resistance he will be capable of mounting when he has at last to confront the heartless, bloodless angels and their demand that he give up his human senses, the senses through which he has apprehended the world. Smell, taste, even hearing, these he will be prepared to relinquish. But to retain the senses of sight and touch, he will be prepared to suffer anything, including torture. And I quote from Alissa Valles' translation, "To the end, he will defend the splendid sensation of pain." And a couple of faded images in the pit of a burnt-out eye. Who knows, thinks Pan Cogito to himself, maybe the angelic interrogators will at last grow tired and give up, declaring him unfit for heavenly service and allowing him to return along an overgrown path on the shore of a white sea to the cave of the beginning. The image of Pan Cogito under torture at the hands of the angels repeats the image of Marsyas tortured by Apollo. The gods believe they are omniscient as well as omnipotent. But in fact, the experience of suffering is beyond their ken, just as being powerless is beyond their powers. It will not have escaped your attention as readers of Herbert that in the greater heavenly pantheon there is in fact a God who suffers, who responds to the charge of being above and beyond suffering by committing himself to suffering in a human way, without relief unto death. This God, the Christian Jesus, does not figure in Herbert's poetic universe. In Pan Cogito's eschatological premonitions, Herbert's skeptical view of heaven, and by implication of all doctrines of salvation or perfectibility, has not been abandoned. The knife turn of paradox is still central to his argument on behalf of the right to feel pain, a right that belongs to animal beings alone. But in this late poem, Herbert goes beyond the neat irony and lapidary perfection of such earlier pieces as Report from Paradise. The last lines of the poem, which I've quoted, open art to a world along an overgrown path on the shore of a white sea to the cave of the beginning, a world that is as strange and as beautiful and as haunting as the world we mortals live in, the world that comes to us through our senses, a world which we cannot forget, which we cannot bear to leave, but which we must leave and must forget forever. There are several dozen Pancogito poems from Herbert's hand across several collections. As a personage, Pancogito makes his first appearance in 1974, and he remains a strong presence in Report from a Besieged City. He starts his life as a self-deprecating mask or persona for the poet, not too different in spirit and style from the wry and hapless little man cartoon characters whom we are familiar with in Polish and Czech cinema of the Cold War years. A poem like Pancogito's Abyss, about the abyss, I quote, not the abyss of Pascal, not the abyss of Dostoevsky, an abyss to Pancogito's size. This abyss that follows Pancogito around like a pet dog might be a fitting script for one of those cartoons. The risk of investing too heavily in the persona of Pancogito, a little man defined by his limitations, his powerlessness, and by his constant resort to irony, the weapon of the powerless, was, I suspect, clear to Herbert from the beginning. A short prose poem called From Mythology, which appears in the early collection Study of the Object, 1961, spells out the danger. The poem presents itself as a potted history of religion, ironical in its dismissive brevity. Stage 1, savages dancing around idols. Stage 2, the Olympians, thunderbolts, creaking beds. Stage 3, the age of irony. People carry around in their pockets votive statues of the god of irony made of salt. Then came the barbarians. They too valued highly the little god of irony. They would crush it under their heels and add it to their dishes. The god of irony, secretly and ironically believed by his devotees to be all-powerful, able to wither his foes with his knowing smile, turns out to be powerless against the barbarians. Worse than that, they relish him, or at least use him as relish. To translate the allegory boldly, the ironist runs the risk of participating in a morally degrading game with the powers that be, in which, as long as he pretends not to be openly confronting them, they will pretend to take no notice of him. So much for irony, not only as a political strategy, but as an ethical refuge, a way of life. If Pancogito is not to be crushed under the heel of the barbarians and used as a condiment, if the Pancogito poems are not to suffer the fate of finding themselves in the school syllabus, then Pancogito cannot just be Pan Zbigniew Herbert, homme moyen sensuel, rhymester and Polish citizen, viewed in the shrinking and distorting glass of irony. He must be more. In an important respect, Pancogito is like Don Quixote, with whom he is explicitly associated in the very first of the Cogitor poems. Like Cervantes' Quixote, Herbert's Pancogitor is a creature whose creator only gradually comes to realize how large a poetic weight he is capable of bearing. The Quixote of the first chapters of Book 1 of the Adventures is simply a foolish old man. The Quixote of Book 2 is larger than the pygmies who surround him, larger even than the knights of old who are his constant companions. Some of the early Pancogitor poems are slight and forgettable, but the envoy of Pancogitor, with which Report from a Besieged City concludes, is one of the great poems of the 20th century. I quote the last lines in Alissa Valles' English translation. Keep watch when a light on the hill gives a sign. Rise and go as long as the blood is still turning the dark star in your breast. Repeat humanity's old incantations, fairy tales, and legends, for that is how you will attain the good you will not attain. Repeat great words, repeat them stubbornly, like those who crossed a desert and perished in the sand. For this they will reward you with what you have at hand, with the whip of laughter, with murder on a garbage heap. Go, for only thus will you be admitted to the company of cold skulls, to the company of your forefathers, Gilgamesh, Hector, Roland, the defenders of the kingdom without bounds and the city of ashes. Be faithful, go. The not entirely transparent title of this poem, The Envoy of Pancogitor, invites one to read it as an envoi, addressed, go, both to the poems contained in Report from a Besieged City and to the poet self behind the mask, at last unmasking himself and speaking without irony. The poem can be read by itself, and even by itself its force is undeniable. But for its proper effect, it needs to be read as the last of this particular Pancogitor series, looking back on its avatars and stripping them of their ironic masks in the cause of telling the truth. Reading it in this way, as a demand, indeed a command to the self to persist in the faithful life, even in the absence of any credible faith, one must be struck by its rhetorical grandeur and moral ferocity, not qualities one usually associates with Herbert, but potentialities that the reader may well have sensed from the beginning behind all the irony. There is one strain notably absent from Herbert's poetic oeuvre as one has it in English, the erotic. Of course, poets are not obliged to write love poems, but all the evidence of Herbert's many essays on art and travel suggest a sensibility open to experience and acutely responsive to beauty. Prayer of the Traveller Pancogitor, a poem from the 1983 collection, though not a great poem in itself, is a heartfelt and palpably sincere prayer of thanks for the gift of life. I quote, "I thank you, O Lord, for creating the world beautiful and various, and if this is your seduction, I am seduced for good and past all forgiveness." Nevertheless, after the 1950s, the erotic fades out of Herbert's work, save in one poem called Oath from 1992, which looks back with regret to beautiful women glimpsed and then lost, in particular a woman he remembers seeing in a newsagent's. I quote, "For a moment, I thought that if I went with you, we would change the world. I will never forget you, a startled flutter of lids, matchless tilt of a head, the bird's nest of a palm." Regret at a life not fully lived and doubt that his achieved work has compensated for that failure becomes a gnawing theme in Herbert's late poetry. Of course, one might argue that the grey Soviet Empire made it hard for any of its subjects to live a full life. In other words, that history was to blame. But to so nagging and lucid a self-doubter as Herbert, shifting the blame away from oneself is not an acceptable strategy. The hero of his famous poem, Why the Classics, is Thucydides, commander of the Athenian forces during the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides makes no excuses for his failures as a general. He faces his judges, reports the facts, accepts his punishment without complaint. Herbert's verdict on his own life comes in a pair of poems, Pancogito and the Imagination, and to Ryszard Krynicki, a letter, both dated 1983, in which, crucially, Herbert identifies his greatest virtue as a moral being, namely his steady, undeceived vision of the world as his principal limitation as a poet. I quote from the first of these poems, Pancogito and the Imagination. He adored tautologies, explanations idem per idem. A bird is a bird, slavery, slavery, a knife, death is death. Pancogito's imagination moves like a pendulum. It runs with great precision from suffering to suffering. For this, Pancogito will be counted among the species minores. First article of the indictment, then, an imagination, a view of the world that is limited, monotonous. So little joy, sister of the gods, in our poems, Ryszard, he writes in the second poem to his friend Krynicki. Too few glimmering twilights, mirrors, wreaths, ecstasies. Or, as he puts it in an even more searingly personal poem, second article of the self-indictment, memory too large and the heart too small. Of course, there is irony at work here, a saving irony. The poem that mocks Pancogito for confining himself to tautologies, a bird is a bird, also implicitly invites us to ask, yet who besides Pancogito, who besides Herbert was saying in 1956 that slavery was slavery? But irony can come wrapped in irony. The decision to become an ironist for life can, ironically, backfire. Or, to recall the extended figure that Herbert uses in the poem, A Small Heart, the bullet that you fired decades ago can go all the way around the globe and hit you in the back. The moral sense, rudimentary but infallible, that you pretended to disparage but really affirmed when, back in the 1950s, you wrote the poem The Knocker, which goes, "My imagination is a piece of board. I thump on the board and it prompts me with the moralist's dry poem, yes, yes, no, no." This begins to sound very tired by the 1980s. Worse than that, what has been the point of a life spent thumping the same old board? This is the pessimistic question that Herbert in his late years asks in poem after poem as he looks back over his life. But is it the right question to be asking? There is an alternative way of understanding why it is that looking back on the post-war decades from the perspective of the 1980s, a poet like Herbert should have felt frustrated and defeated. As long as slavery was slavery, under Stalin, under Gomulka, Pan Cogito knew his way and knew his vocation. But when slavery modulated into subtler forms of servitude, as in the reform era presided over by Gierek, when shops were suddenly stocked with imported goods bought with borrowed money, or even more markedly, when Poland made its first entry into the world of globalized consumerism in 1989, Pan Cogito's power to do justice to a new reality failed him. This is hardly a damning charge. Who among the world's poets has measured up to the challenge of late capitalism? And why else is the present age recognizably not a great age of poetry? I quote from a poem entitled Pan Cogito's Monster, in which Herbert seems to foresee this particular defeat. Pan Cogito's monster lacks all dimensions. It's hard to describe. It eludes definitions. It's like a vast depression hanging over the country. It can't be pierced by a pen, an argument, a spear. There's one further quality of this hard-to-describe monster that Pan Cogito might have mentioned, that it has somehow managed to transcend or at least get beyond good and evil, and thus to get beyond the reach of the dry moralist's yes, no. To the monster that hangs over the land, all things are good, in the sense that all things are consumable, including the ironist's little salt artifacts. I conclude. I do not know much about Zbigniew Herbert the man, but I'm not sure that I want to know more about him than I do. If Herbert felt toward the end of his life that he had given too much of himself to his art, had lived too little, and if he felt, moreover, that his art had not measured up to the challenge of the times, well, that is a story I've heard before from other great artists, a story that I take cum grano salis, with a grain of salt. To me, the true Zbigniew Herbert is constituted by a body of poetry that extends over 4 of the most demanding decades of the history of modern Europe. Herbert's response to the demands of his times was to remain stubbornly, monotonously faithful to the human, not the timeless Praxitelean ideal of the human, but the flesh and blood human, stumbling along in the dark across a landscape littered with the bones of other brave men, Gilgamesh, Hector, Roland. For that I honor him. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that we could be here today, and I would especially like to thank the poet and writer for this story about Herbert, for telling a story about Herbert that grows directly out of his poems. I'm very touched by what was essentially a confession. So thank you very much. I want to thank all the writers, all the Ryszard, Alissa, and John. First of all, I want to thank John Maxwell Coetzee for this beautiful, this wise vision of Herbert based on his poetry. I'm very grateful for that. And to you, Ryszard. You're a great poet and a great friend. Not to mention Alissa, who's done great things for Herbert. He wouldn't, I suppose, be known in the States without you, my dear Alissa. Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed.
Proszę Państwa,
today is October 29. It's Herbert's birthday. It so happens that a month ago, on the 29th of September, we commemorated the first anniversary of the death of Zbigniew Herbert, the sister of Zbigniew Herbert, Halina Herbert-Żebrowska. I want to welcome Beata Lechnio with her husband and children. Beata. And together with Katarzyna Herbert, we want to mention the sister-in-law, actually the sister of the poet, who always supported our foundation. And even though she couldn't attend these events, she was very happy that the International Zbigniew Herbert Literary Award was established, and she wrote a beautiful memoir of her brother that's on our website. And for her kindness, her warmth, and her love for her brother, we celebrate her today. At the end of this event, it's always my pleasure to say words of thanks. Today, I want to begin by thanking an extraordinary person, extraordinary people, and an institution. Alissa and myself thanked Ryszard and Krynicki for their work, for all they've done to publish Herbert's poetry. But we also have with us here today Barbara Toruńczyk, the founder of Zeszyty Literackie. Zeszyty Literackie published Herbert's prose, his letters, and served the cause of Polish culture for decades. Barbara. Thank you very much. I'm very touched. I'm very humbled. And I did it all with my team, with my colleagues who are here today, Marek Zagańczyk and Mikołaj Nowak-Robrzyński. And we were a team very dedicated to Herbert. We did it with great devotion and admiration and with great love. As always, our thanks go out to the Foundation's partners, the director of the National Library, Tomasz Makowski, and the entire staff at this library who made this event possible. We want to thank the Adam Mickiewicz Institute for being our partner on all projects, the Traple Konarski-Podecki law firm for their invaluable legal support, and we want to thank Polish Radio for their media patronage. And in closing, a word of thanks to the sponsor of this event. Once again, it is PGE, Polska Grupa Energetyczna, and I want to invite Magdalena Piekacz so we could thank you along with Katarzyna Herbert personally. And traditionally, a drawing of Zbigniew Herbert. A drawing by Zbigniew Herbert transferred into a lithograph by our friends at the Academy of Fine Arts. It's a copy of Rembrandt. Since these particular drawings are heavy, we'll deliver them at a later date. There's one person who's not with us today, the president of the PZU Foundation, but I'm very happy to inform you that the PZU Foundation has once again agreed to be the strategic sponsor of the Zbigniew Herbert Literary Award. Thank you to the PZU Foundation, and a drawing by Zbigniew Herbert that will be delivered to the PZU Foundation. And now, after all the words of thanks, please join us downstairs for a reception, for a glass of wine, a birthday toast. Thank you very much to all of you for coming here today.